Way back before Ford bought the place up and began renovations, I used to urbex at the Michigan Central Station in Detroit. For those that don't know, the old Central Station is a huge 18-story building that gigantic pitch-black basement. Back then, there were a few ways to get in. But by far the best entrance, which was least likely to get you caught by security, was a tunnel dug underneath the steel wall of the train garage next to the station. It wasn't a particularly long tunnel. It just went deep enough into the ground to clear the wall, but then it came right back up again into the compound on the other side and gave you a straight shot in and out. Like I already mentioned, the garage itself was pitch black with numerous pits, so mechanics could work under the trans. Picture the underground areas and a mechanic shop. These pits tended to be full of trash, nasty stuff to broken glass, scrap metal, and other items that could easily impale and kill you by falling in them, and that anyone who went inside the garage was well advised to bring a flashlight or they'd risk falling into what were basically death traps. But at the same time, it was equally essential you used your flashlight sparingly, as any light shining out from within the building could easily be seen by people walking past the building outside, which at the times we visited the place would most likely be the cops or security. This particular trip to the station would be my last for a number of different reasons. And the guys I had with me had much less experience doing urban exploration, particularly at this building. My buddy C had been once before, but hadn't been through the entire building. And this other guy we found online had never visited at all. Before he went inside, I explained the thing about being careful with flashlights whenever the hazards we'd be facing, and I especially made it clear that the security guards patrolling around the building would be pretty thick from around midnight to 5 or 6 in the morning. Then after the little mission brief, we headed there in the evening, and by the time we got there, it was almost night. Getting inside was basically the easiest part, and I think how easy it was gave us all the sense of overconfidence. We milled around C's car until we saw one security guy drive by the tunnel entrance. In the second, he turned the corner. We went one by one into the tunnel and back up again into the garage. After that, we began to properly explore at our leisure. A big motivation for wanting to get inside was that the station was known for being the go-to place for some absolutely incredible graffiti artists. I'm talking cream of the crop of the Detroit street art scene. I think one of the main attractions for me personally would probably be the 13th floor, as the graffiti was all based around all these dark subjects like the devil, the underworld, all super creepy stuff. Like that, we took our time drinking all that stuff and taking pictures and stuff, and then headed up even higher to what I considered the mother lode of Detroit urbex, the station's roof. We made it all the way up there without so much as a hitch, then gazed out in awe at the 360-degree view of Detroit. Up there, he felt like a king. Like he owned everything. The light didn't touch the kind of steal a line from the Lion King. Again, pictures were taken. But instead of the near constant chattering that went on while we were exploring the 13th floor, all three of us stayed completely silent, a testament of just how incredible the view was. Then, when we were done, we started making our way back down. But this is where things started to go horribly wrong. Robbie, completely contradicting all my warnings, kept turning his flashlight on to look at different patches of graffiti. I had to continuously tell him to turn it off, but it was like he turned into a child. He just wouldn't listen to a word I was saying. Then CU kept going off on his own to look at stuff, even though staying in a tight group is what kept you relatively safe. Then as we kept moving down level after level, CC is one of the open elevator shafts around the 8th or 9th floor and decides that he wants to throw a glass bottle down it just for fun. I pled to him that it's not worth getting that close to it, that it's too dangerous. But once again, he didn't listen. It was like all the overconfidence had completely ruined any kind of professionalism or discipline we had. And it almost killed us. Who said he'd be careful, dismissing me like I was an overprotective parent or something. And then he starts walking over towards the open elevator shaft. He throws the bottle in, then leans into the shaft to watch the bottle fall with his flashlight. But then, to my absolute horror, he slips on a broken piece of flooring and falls into the elevator shaft 10 stories up. I ran over to the shaft in a panic, thinking I was about to see one of my best friend's lifeless bodies all the way down at the bottom. But by some kind of miracle, he'd managed to grab some of the elevator cables as he fell, and was only maybe 2 or 3 floors below us, hanging on for dear life. When he caught his breath, he let out the loudest scream for help I'd ever heard. I told him to hang on, to not let go no matter how much it hurts his hands. It was that or die. Me and Robbie then sprinted as fast as we could to the staircase. And I nearly killed myself in the process. As I leaped down the staircase trying to get to the floor I believed he was closest to when he got to the elevator shaft and looked in. I saw that he was right above me between floors, still begging for help. I told him he was too far up. And that if he wanted to live, he would have to come down a bit closer for me to be able to grab him and hang on. He was in tears, crying, telling me I can't do it, man, I can't do it. And I could see the blood running down his arms from where he'd slice both his palms from grabbing those cables. I told him he had to, but he had no choice. But again, it was do as I said, or it would be all over for him. I gave him words of encouragement and told him to fight the pain. But that he had to slide down just a little more, just a little more. And that if he did what I knew he could do, that everything would be okay. I swear to God, I've never seen anything so brave. He just kind of sucked it up and slowly worked his way down. But that didn't mean that he wasn't howling in pain the whole time. He screamed, but he did it. He worked his way down until we got close enough that me and Robbie were able to reach out and pull them in. His hands were a bloody mess, 2 thick gashes across both of them. So I took off my undershirt and wrapped up both of his hands, not because he was going to bleed to death or anything. I just wanted to feel like I was doing something and also to calm down as best I could, because getting caught would still mean getting busted for trespassing, and the noises that he was making would definitely get us caught. As relieved as I was that he was alive, I still wanted to beat him for his stupidity. So after chewing them out for being so stupid, and choking up with tears as I did it, I told them that it was probably time that we get out of there. I thought it was all over, that the worst was done, but that wasn't entirely true. As we made our way down the remaining floors and into the main lobby, I see Robbie stop in his tracks, quickly back up and turn around. Even in the dark, I watched him turn pale. I asked him what was wrong, and only said, "Cops." 4 Detroit police officers just entered the lobby from the main entrance. Someone must have heard all the screaming and called 911. That looked at both Robbie and C, and with a voice that was shaking with fear, told them to follow and fast. I took them through a maze of hallways, each of us running on nothing but adrenaline. The only thing was, I hadn't actually explored the places we were running down. So after a minute or two, we hit a dead end with nowhere to go except a pitch black room next to us, which meant we had no other option but to slip into the room and stand as still as we could against the walls. I didn't have to tell them to stay quiet. As much as they had been acting dumb before, they knew better than to make any sound by that point. And I'll never forget the sound of the cops' radios going off and footsteps getting closer. But then I remember hearing another sound to that drip, drip, drip of blood running off the pieces of my undershirt that was wrapped around C's hands. A few minutes went by, that dripping sound carrying on the whole time, before one of the cops started walking down our dead-end hallway, his flashlight beam bouncing in and out of the room we all stood in, but somehow never actually touching any of us. I kept thinking the sound of dripping blood would give us away, but looking back on now, I think he just figured it was a dripping pipe or something. We all held our breath as he was a few feet away from the room, and then heard him say on his radio, "Always clear." I wanted to let out the biggest sigh of relief in my life. But I couldn't. None of us could. We all just stayed silent as he turned around and proceeded back down the hall. We stood there still and silent for what seemed at least a half an hour. But it couldn't have been any longer than about a minute or two. I could hear my heartbeat inside my ear canals like a drum, just this booming until it finally started to slow down and lessen in intensity. We waited until it was dead silent, then crept our way back to the train garages slowly and quietly as we could and made our way out. The car ride home was dead quiet. And I never went back to the train station again. We were just focused on getting to the hospital. That was 8 years ago now. And I think about that whole thing at least once a week, how our lives and our freedoms were on the line. But some kind of miracle kept anything serious from happening to us. I guess I should be thankful that all I have are the memories, because Percy he has the scars to remind him too. Back when I was a dumb teenager, me and my buddies got into our heads that it'd be a good idea to explore the storm drainage system underneath our neighborhood. Picture the ones in that movie, but just all made of concrete, since they were the round kind of sewer tunnels made from pre-made pieces. Getting down there was no small feat, and you had to crawl through a real tight fit for maybe 10 to 15 feet before there was any standing room. But then after that, as you explore deeper, you'd find areas that were big enough to drive a golf cart through, not that it would have been impossible to get one down there. Just to give you an idea of how big the tunnels were. Every so often, you come across these really weird-looking structures, things that look like grates or prison bars that only covered half the pipe. Sometimes you'd see a little light coming in from a grate and the road above. But most of the time, we needed flashlights to see anything at all. Every single sound was nerve-wracking, because technically, there shouldn't have been any sounds other than running water down there. So whenever you heard anything creaking or groaning, it made the hairs in the back of your neck stand up. While you wondered if you were finally about to run into that sewer gator, or whatever urban legend that had gotten into our heads during that day or week or months. It also wasn't like we had a map or anything in order to even think to draw one up. So most of the local kids who had gotten to know the system well enough to navigate through it just had all the knowledge in their heads. At one point, we all figured out that if you got lost, all you had to do was choose a turn that led to a bigger pipe. That was because the biggest one ran for about a half mile all the way outside the neighborhood, eventually emptying by a 15-foot waterfall type thing into a local pond and creek. With this in mind, one day my brother, to walk the fine line between Bray even DME, decided to go a different direction from the main junction with his friends to explore a tunnel none of us had ever ventured to. I had joined them that day, and I'm not afraid to admit that I was way too scared to follow him. I'm not sure why I was so creeped out that day. I always felt safe with my brother. But for some reason, I just had this really bad feeling that day. So I didn't want to go with him deeper into the tunnels. As he went off, me and 2 friends stayed in the junction while my brother and his 2 friends went exploring. But then, after they were gone for 10 or 15 minutes, we suddenly started hearing this terrified screaming, accompanied by the sound of quick footsteps echoing down the tunnels as they came running back towards us. My friends just bowled it. And as much as I wanted to run to, is only my brother that seemed to be in danger. So I just couldn't bring myself to leave him, even if he was with a few friends of his own. Seconds later, I saw them turn around a bend and the most dark tunnel, and I heard one of my brother's friends shouting, "Run, run, run." They didn't need to tell me twice. And I joined them as we all sprinted down the big tunnel. I think the worst part was that we all instinctively knew that whatever was down there chasing us might actually catch us if we had to shimmy back through the small pipes to get out of the way we came in. With that in mind, we ran as fast as we possibly could down the bigger tunnels, flashlight beams just waving all over the place until we finally started seeing light from where the tunnel emptied into the pond. Then one by one, we all just leapt into the pond below, as getting soaked and ruining our flashlights was much more preferable to getting caught by whoever they were running from. I was terrified of heights at the time. And I definitely wasn't the strongest swimmer. But the fear and adrenaline took over, and when the time came, I just jumped in and we all made it to dry land. It occurred to me that they might have been playing a prank on us. But then the fear and my brother's voice as he insisted that we all go home right away convinced me that they really had seen something down there that seriously freaked them out. I kept asking him what he'd seen on our way home. But he wouldn't talk to me about it. It just kept saying that he needed to get his head straight, that he wasn't sure who it was that he'd seen. He just knew that they didn't have good intentions. I realized just how serious things were when we got home and my brother told my mom where we'd been and what we'd been doing. He knew that meant that we'd both be in quite a bit of trouble. Even more so when our mom learned that he'd let me his younger brother go somewhere that dangerous. Mom was obviously angry. But when she calmed down, my brother told her that when he and his friends reached a junction, the tunnel that they were exploring, they came across a spot where light was trickling in from above. There was a pile of trash and debris built up around one of those half-pipe prison bar gates, and laying within that pile of trash, they saw a man, a completely naked man. And when this guy heard them, he raised himself up, covered in dirt and grime, and started crawling out of the trash on all fours in their direction while making this low growling sound. And that's what had them so scared that they just ran without a thought. Upon hearing that, our mom just called the cops to cops in uniform, then drove over to our house to ask my brother to guide them to the location in the pipes where this happened. At first, he refused, but after some reassurance from the officers and pressure from our mom, my brother was convinced to go back. I heard they found exactly what he described, but the so-called man was gone. Then within an hour, there were at least a dozen police cars around our neighborhood with people and dogs searching that drainage system. They wouldn't tell us much in the way of details, but I do know that they never found the guy who chased us. I heard the dogs following his scent trail to the end of the pipe at the pond, but they never picked up the scent anywhere on the ground around the pond or creek. None of us ever went into the storm drains again. And the guy in the sewers became a kind of urban legend that I'm pretty sure is still talked about my hometown today. Only my brother and friends know for certain that it's true. And although I didn't see the Superman personally, I believe that he was real. And there's no way my brother would act like that unless he actually saw someone down there. Back when I was in my early 20s, I ended up homeless for a while. I don't really want to get into exactly how that happened because it's a long story. Have a really painful bunch of memories. But the point is that I ended up looking for somewhere to squat. And that place ended up being an abandoned house and quite a dodgy suburb here in Rockhampton, just to clear things up. It wasn't strictly abandoned. It was a full-on squat with several other people living there. But it definitely wasn't legal. We had running water from time to time, which we were basically stealing off the water companies, and every so often they'd send someone out to turn it off, but we just turned it back on again. We also had electricity, thanks to this really polluted generator we kept on the back of our house. And when we had money left over after buying our meth or heroin, we buy some petrol to keep it running. And we didn't have money left over, we'd siphoned off what we could from cars around the neighborhood. To be honest, it was probably the best I lived while I was homeless. And as much as it was rough living, at least I could wash and have a roof over my head. It was also pretty safe as squats go, as it had these really high fences we had to climb to get in. Yeah, this got a bit annoying from time to time, especially if you were high and weren't in the best frame of mind for climbing. But they mostly kept people from seeing onto the property, and that worked for us. But then the reason it had all these high fences is the same reason that when I first arrived there and went wandering into the front yard, I was greeted by something that made my skin crawl. There was this old doghouse with a broken chain leading out of it. Right in front of the opening was what looked like a load of dried blood. When asked someone who'd been living there for a while, "What's the deal with the literally bloody doghouse?" they told me, this place used to belong to a drug dealer, nabbed him in a dawn raid, and the dog went for the jacks when they burst through the gate. They shot it, took the thing's body away, never cleaned up the blood though. As you can see, that was about the one and only time I ever saw it. As for the most part, we all lived in the rear of the house so that it still looked abandoned if you were looking at it from the street. And we entered and exited the place by climbing over the back fence. Our one big worry was the jacks finding out that we were there. And even then, the laws here regarding squatting is a bit complex. So they couldn't kick us out. If the AFP made it a drug thing, then that would be a different story. But we generally considered ourselves pretty safe outside of that. That was just one thing we didn't consider. And that was the opinion of the house's former owner when word got to him that we were squatting in his place. So this one night, I woke to the sound of someone banging really hard on the front of the house. The girl I was sharing a room with at the time was already awake. But when I asked her if it was the Jacks, she stayed quiet and just shook her head. The police usually announce themselves, don't they have hammer on the door and shot police open up or something? But whoever was outside was staying as quiet as we were. They were really hammering on the door to so hard the whole house seemed to be shaking. And although we maybe should have actually done something, be it hide or run or at least get ready to defend ourselves, all we did was stay quiet and hope they go away. Which they did. After maybe an hour or so of silence. The older guy who explained what happened to the dog to me goes downstairs and takes a look around to make sure the bangers had really gone. About a minute later, he comes back upstairs and tells me to come look at the front door. It was already open when I went down, and even in the near darkness, I could see that whoever had been banging had rammed something through the wood of the front door. It was this huge Bowie knife-looking thing. So big that it was more like a machete than an actual knife. We just left it where it was, mainly because there was no way of actually dislodging the thing. But also because we were kidding ourselves into thinking that if we did leave it, whoever had left it there might think that there was actually no one squatting. Like I said before, we had it really good there relatively speaking anyway, so not everyone wanted to just pack up and leave right away. The girl I was sharing a room with did, though she was gone when I woke up after going back to sleep. And I think she ended up in one of the legit homeless shelters in the city, but I can't be sure, and the rest of us decided to take our chances. A few days later, me and this other fella nipped out to get some food during the afternoon. We usually hit up a couple of different places in the city, picking up whatever yellow sticker food we could find, pinching more expensive things and going to food banks for our staples, the point being, and we were gone a good couple of hours before we started walking back towards the squat. Because we had to climb in over the back fence. The usual routine was that one of us would climb up and straddle the wall. Then the other would pass the food bags up to them for them to drop down the other side as gently as possible. The other person I was with jumps up onto the wall, it takes one look at the squat, then freezes. Looking at the squat with this scared look on his face. I asked him what the problem is. And he just looks down at me and says, "Leave the food." I go to climb up myself to see what he's looking at. And he just says no. And then hangs on the wall for a second, looking around as if though he's watching for any signs of anyone. Then, only when he saw the coast, was clear that he say it was safe for me to climb up. Obviously, I'm curious. So I climb up over the wall myself. And the first thing I see is that all the back windows of the squat had been broken, and the back door had been smashed off its hinges. We go inside. And basically everything had either been broken or smashed. All the furniture, all the gear we had, they're all either flipped over or completely destroyed. Upstairs, there's clothes everywhere, empty bags and stuff. And it looked like all the other squatters had either left in a hurry or been chased out by someone. In one room, there was the spray of fresh blood on the wall. Not a lot of it. But enough for us to know that some sort of violence had occurred while the place was getting trashed. We salvaged what we could, then just got out of there ourselves. I'm still not entirely sure what happened there. The mind and the other guy's best guess is that the dealer who owned the place had gotten wind that people were using his house as a squat and wanted us out of there. It was his friends, or in these people he'd organized to pay us a visit, that had left the knife in the door as a warning. Then they returned on the day of our food shop to make sure everyone was gone. Obviously, not everyone was gone. So they chased them out after hitting someone with something that caused the blood spray. The really messed up thing is that I didn't actually want to go on the food run. I really couldn't be bothered. But it was my turn. And although I tried to convince another one of the squatters to go in my place, that hadn't worked. So I was basically forced to head out if I wanted to eat. If he had been a good friend and covered for me, it might have been me who took that shot to the head. At least, I'm assuming it was a shot to the head. I don't know of any part of your body that will squirt blood like that after taking a hit. It's just weird thinking that I was so close to being a victim in that situation. And it makes you wonder if there had been any other times in your life when you narrowly dodged something bad via some spur-of-the-moment decision, or whatever. For anyone wondering, I'm doing much better these days. I have a job and I'm living back with my mom until I can afford a deposit on a place of my own. I'm not exactly flying high or anything like that. I only work in a burger joint and the pay is pretty terrible. But anything is better than living in squats as an addict. That's something I never want to go back to. When I was growing up, me and my family lived on a council estate that was within spitting distance of some abandoned docklands. My hometown used to be famous for shipbuilding. But we suffered a massive economic decline in the 70s and 80s. And this meant that miles upon miles of industrial sprawl was left almost completely deserted. We went from a place people would move to in order to start a life for themselves to the place people would move away from just to survive. The only reason my family stayed is because my dad was a teacher and my mom was a nurse, to the few professions that weren't affected when the shipyards went belly up. What if your living relied on the shipyards? You were pretty much buggered, and bit by bit, the town started to die. And although it's never actually straight up, kick the bucket, the decline had a horrible effect on the locals. Like I said, the docklands and warehouses near our house ended up completely abandoned. And as I grew into my teenage years, me and my friends started sneaking into the area to nose around the compounds. It wasn't like there was much else to do to keep us entertained. And although we probably should have spent our spare time playing football or hanging around the youth center, or inclination for mischief, man, trespassing among the empty warehouses was much more exciting. We'd find a way in, be it through ripping up a section of plastic-coated chain-link fence or by digging under a section of the solid iron gating, then just kind of mess around until it was time to go home. During our early teens, that consisted of playing manhunt or having WWF-style wrestling match, she's on the patches of overgrown grass. But then as we got older, the Woody, as we call it, don't ask me why the name just stuck and became a place we could experiment with tobacco and alcohol away from the prying eyes of our parents. And for years, we thought the Woody was a place we had all to ourselves. And that really meant something to us. But it turns out, we were very, very wrong. There's just one more piece of backstory I've got to get out of the way before I really get into the story. And that concerns the security guard who patrolled the warehouses. I suppose someone still owned the land. And either they didn't want it to get into too bad a shape of disrepair, or they had some legal obligation to make sure no silly kids like us ended up getting hurt while trespassing. Either way, we had to keep on the lookout for security guards at all times. That only enhanced the excitement for us, though, being somewhere we weren't supposed to be. And whenever he happened to show up, which was a rare event, we always just shouted bail, then legged that back towards one of our entry and exit points. We all knew that. The worst that would happen is that he tells us to just clear off or something. We'd been caught red-handed before. So there came a point when the only reason we'd run was just for the thrill of it. 9 times out of 10, the security guy either didn't patrol the area we were in, I suppose he wasn't the most diligent security bloke around, or we just hired after spotting him when he didn't feel like running. And that's why we were also confused. One day when a mate of ours called Chris started running off after going for a slash with a look on his face, like he'd seen a ghost. We all do our usual thing, joining him and running off towards one of our usual escape points. When instead of taking a breather and contemplating going back when we were at a safe distance, Chris basically threw himself under the fence in a way that actually really frightened us. One by one, we scramble under the fence. And I remember hearing another lad asking Chris exactly what he'd seen, because no one ever acted like that if they'd spotted the security guard. He just kept saying, I saw someone, but then didn't know exactly who it was. Other than that, definitely wasn't the security guard. Everyone kept asking him to at least describe the person he'd seen, height, weight, hair color, anything that might give us an idea of who it was. But the most Chris could give us is that the person looked like they'd been wearing a wooden mask. And that's when I realized that he was playing an elaborate prank on us. I mean, the person he'd seen in the Woody had been wearing a wooden mask, no chance that just stank of on-the-spot thinking to me, the kind of think a person would make up on the fly via word association or something, you know. Okay, maybe I'm describing that wrong, but I'm sure you get what I mean. I just started to smell nonsense all of a sudden, and I basically decided there and then that as much as his acting had been BAFTA-worthy, it was just that, an act. After that, he just wouldn't come back to the Woody with us and insisted we find somewhere else to hang out. This almost caused a bit of a rift in our friend group. And for a while, we just didn't see Chris outside of school. But then eventually, I think we just missed all hanging out together. So we compromised and found another place to hang out there that wasn't among the abandoned warehouses. This also might have had something to do with the fact that Chris's dad was a raging alcoholic, and that Chris would basically steal cans of beer with his dad, assuming he drank them all by himself. But at the same time, we did genuinely miss hanging out with him. So cut to a few months later, when spring had turned into the summer holidays, the wood-faced man had turned into a bit of old wives' tales among us by that point. And a few of the other kids in our year group had heard Chris talk about him as well. But the whole time I just took them out amusement in the idea that it was all just some big mess about me and Chris are down by the stream that ran through some farmers' fields about a half an hour away from our estate. I mentioned something about missing hanging out about the Woody and he flat out says, "I often don't." I laugh, and then tell him to wind his neck in that he doesn't need to pretend that the wood-faced man is real around me, that I know he was only taking the mick to scare people and that it was nothing but a prank. Actually expecting them to crack a smile and say, "All right, you got me," before admitting that he just couldn't be bothered risking his neck in such a dangerously crumbling place. But instead, he actually starts getting really annoyed with me and says things like the economy a liar, Aria. I tried to explain that I wasn't strictly calling him a liar. More likable is just a very effective prank he used to get us all to hang out somewhere different. And this only makes him more angry with me. And eventually he just gets up and storms off. Obviously, I followed him, telling him I didn't mean anything by it. But he didn't talk to me for like the whole way back into town. I learned pretty quickly to just not bring it up anymore. Not so much because I actually believed him, but because I knew it would only cause a fight. And then that's about the last time we talked about it for almost 2 years. So 2 years after the whole wood-faced man thing, there's this horrible incident involving a really nasty assault that occurred on what we called the Woody, but with all the adults always called the abandoned industrial estate. Somehow, the police got wind of the fact that we used to hang around there a fair bit. And one day, I come home from a bike ride to find these 2 policemen sitting in the kitchen, with my mom over a cup of tea. After assuring me that I wouldn't be in any trouble, that they weren't interested in doing me for trespassing, or anything. The questions all involve things that I might have seen while exploring the Woody that didn't ask about a suspect right away. But I knew how to get there. Eventually. I just had no idea what was coming. I had to tell them no time after time, when they asked if I'd ever seen anyone personally. But then thoughts of Chris's wood-faced man started popping into my head. At the moment I even mentioned a friend of mine, having seen someone frightening there once. They'd asked me if he'd ever described what the person had looked like. I told them that the ad only a little bit, but he had, and then one of the officers asked me something that actually stunned me into silence. It looks this partner, then turns to me, and says that your friend ever mentioned anything about a wooden mask. I was so stunned that I just couldn't even respond for a few seconds. All I did was just stare at the policeman until he asked me if I was okay, and repeated the question. All I did was nod. And when I finally found the words, I told them that they were probably better off speaking to Chris about the wood-faced man. As for years by that point, I just thought that he was making it up. As far as I know, the real-life person behind the wooden masks was never caught. But his victims were so traumatized by the attack which apparently lasted hours, that she and her family ended up as yet another family moving out of our dying town. The police searched the woody intensively and apparently found evidence that someone had been living in one of the abandoned warehouses that we hadn't explored. How the security guard never found the guy, I'm not sure. But this is all beside the point, to be honest, because the thing that really affected me was having to apologize to Chris about not believing a story. It wasn't a prank. He wasn't making it up. He really had seen someone wearing a wooden mask. And if he hadn't warned us about it, if he hadn't insisted that we hang around somewhere else instead, that might have been one of us getting beat half to death, instead.